Local production of The Story of Smith Field was brought to you in part by
Chapter 2 of the Experimental Aircraft Association promotes sport aviation and aeronautical education in northeastern Indiana. Over 1,100 children have experienced their first flight at Smith Airfield through the EAA's Young Eagles program. Chapter 2 activities include monthly meetings, social activities, cross-country trips, and more.
I'm an Experimental Aircraft Association member, and you can be one too, because they put the fun back in flying.
More information is available by calling 1-800-JOIN-EAA. Smith Field is not the birthplace of aviation in and around Fort Wayne. In fact, it's not the oldest airport in the area, and didn't even get the name Smith Field until the city lost a battle with the U.S. Army. Smith Field started life as little more than an open field, a few buildings, and a windsock. But it grew to become one of the most modern airfields in the Midwest. The first local person to take to the skies did so right downtown. In the 1860s, a Professor Bannister is reported to have lifted off from Main and Bar Streets in downtown Fort Wayne in a balloon. This early flight cost him $300. It would be almost 50 years before motorized flight even became a possibility. Advancements happened very quickly during the early years of flight, with the Wright brothers and other early pioneers like Glenn Curtiss pushing this new technology at an incredible pace. Glenn's innovations and achievements went beyond airplane design and implementation. He was also one of the first flying instructors. In 1910, he established a flying school and exhibition company and took on his one and only female student, Blanche Scott. She became one of the first women flyers in the world during what was supposed to be a training session on the ground. Glenn used a wood block to govern the engine's speed while Blanche practiced taxiing. Blanche apparently found and removed the block and quickly found herself on her first solo flight. She joined Curtiss's exhibition team, and on October 24, 1910, the first public flight by a woman took place in Fort Wayne, Indiana. This historic flight took place in Driving Park, an area north of East State Boulevard and east of Crescent Avenue, what is now the Forest Park neighborhood. Unlike Blanche Scott, most people couldn't afford to pay for flight lessons. If you were daring enough and you wanted to fly, you had to build your own airplane and teach yourself. Art Smith decided to do just that. Art was born and raised in Fort Wayne and had always dreamed of flying. Art had never seen an airplane up close or talked to any aviators. It was 1910, and Fort Wayne didn't have any airports. Using descriptions from books and magazines, along with his imagination, he began designing a flying machine. He estimated it would take about 6 weeks to build it, and convinced his parents to mortgage the house to fund his project. 6 months later, Art's rather unique creation was finished. Note the rather large vertical control surfaces sticking out from the top and bottom of the wings, also the drooping tail. Art had never flown before either, so in January of 1911, he rolled his plane out to Memorial Park for his first self-taught flying lesson in his homemade machine. Amazingly, Art's machine took quickly to the air, although briefly, before crashing into the snow. Art spent the next 5 weeks in bed nursing his injuries, but he was determined to succeed. He concluded the elevator was too large and the controls were too tight. As soon as he was able to, he rebuilt his machine and flew again, and repaired again, and flew again. Art learned more with each repair and redesign, but money was quickly running out. The family lost the house to the bank. His mother stayed with some relatives while Art and his father lived in a barn outside of town.
My father was Bill Kyle, and he was Art Smith's mechanic. He was a type of a person that liked working with tools and cars and things of that sort, and was part of the team of building these airplanes and keeping them running and putting them back together and rebuilding them after they got banged up and that. He was like 15, 16 years old when he started doing this. Of course, Art Smith was pretty young at that time, too.
Art was determined to make it, and his piloting skills and confidence grew with every flight. He would announce flights from Fort Wayne to New Haven, a formidable trip at the time, and huge crowds would gather and pay money to watch this local pilot take to the skies. He found jobs flying for local fairs and festivals. He didn't make much, but it was enough. Art had indeed become an aviator, and the crowds loved him. Art's airplane had only one seat, but he did give his longtime girlfriend, Amy Coor, a 5-minute ride on his flying machine. Her father found out and forbid his daughter from associating with Art again. Madly in love, they decided to elope. Amy discovered she wasn't old enough to get married in Indiana without her father's consent, but the laws were favorable in Michigan. Art made a makeshift seat for Amy, and they flew north, headed for Hillsdale, Michigan. The engine stopped just short of Hillsdale, and Art and Amy crash-landed in a farmer's field. A local minister was recruited to perform the ceremony while the couple lay injured in bed. As always, Art was undeterred by the accident, although he rarely took up passengers again. He focused instead on stunt flying. To most, flying itself was a stunt to behold, but Art had heard of others doing incredible maneuvers in their airplanes and being paid handsomely to perform. It wasn't long before he had earned a solid reputation as a performer and stunt flyer, often billed as the Bird Boy of Fort Wayne and the Wizard of the Air. He was the main attraction at the World's Exposition in San Francisco in 1915. He attached fireworks to the tips of his wings. Art Smith is credited with inventing skywriting. He did his stunts at night, an incredibly risky maneuver at the time. His fame grew, and Art attracted fans like Wild Bill Cody and Teddy Roosevelt. He was performing all across the country, thrilling audiences and receiving enthusiastic praises of the public. And he was being paid handsomely, $10,000 to appear at the Texas State Fair. That's the equivalent to about $175,000 today. He took some of his money to pay back his parents for their support. He bought them a new home in Fort Wayne on Bass Road. He was becoming one of the social elite, with famous friends, and endorsement deals, selling typewriters, phone service, and Red Crown gasoline. Although the safety standards at the time seemed to be a bit loose, smoking while holding a can of gas next to an airplane seems a bit risky.
My dad, he got a cigar in his mouth, but the cigar's not lit. I think he had sense enough to know that you don't be smoking a cigar and pouring gasoline.
Art's fame spread across the nation and even overseas. In 1916, he received an offer to perform at several different cities in Japan for $10,000. Art gathered his crew, crated his plane, and set off on a tour of Japan. The Japanese were thrilled with his performances, and every city he went to gave him a medal to honor his skills and daring. They treated him like royalty, and Art and his crew soaked it up.
My father went with Art Smith and all of the crew to Japan. I can't imagine what that must have been like back in those days.
The tour was cut short when Art had an accident in Sapporo and broke his leg. He returned to the States, but promised to finish the tour when he mended. Art was a successful stunt flyer, a wealthy man, and in great demand. But his personal life was coming apart. His marriage to Amy was in trouble. There were rumors of another man in her life. Amy accused Art of becoming swell-headed. Whatever the reason, Art filed for divorce in 1917. On the same day he filed, he left to continue his tour of Japan. Once again, Art thrilled the crowds. One newspaper estimated 70,000 spectators witnessed the Oyama exhibition. But the war in Europe was growing closer. Art was often quoted as saying he would be ready if America joined the fight. After the United States entered the war in April of 1917, Art left Japan and his stunt flying behind.
When World War I came along, Art Smith was so badly beat up. I mean, he had so many crashes and he had so many healed up injuries and that the Air Corps at that time wouldn't bring him in as a pilot, but he was an instructor.
Some said he was refused because he was too short. Whatever the reason, instead of becoming a pilot, Art was assigned to train and test pilots. From 1917 until 1920, he was stationed at Langley Field in Virginia, Carruthers Field in Texas, and Wilbur Wright Field in Ohio. In 1921, he joined the U.S. Airmail Service, flying mail in the Midwest between Chicago and Cleveland. Flying the mail meant flying in all types of weather conditions, and it was risky even for the most experienced pilots. In February of 1926, Art was forced down during a snowstorm over Montpelier, Ohio. He crashed into a tree and was killed. The city and the world were shocked. The Emperor of Japan sent a telegram asking if it were true that the bird boy had died. Art had thrilled and inspired millions and brought international recognition to this small Indiana city. In 1928, a monument to Art Smith was erected in Memorial Park, where many of Art's first flights took place. Today, a replica of one of Art Smith's early planes hangs in the boarding area of Fort Wayne International Airport, a modern testament to a man who not only chased his dream, he caught it, put wings and an engine on it, and flew it, to the excitement of all who saw him. Like most cities, Fort Wayne's first airport was really a farmer's field with a windsock. In the early 1920s, Captain Floyd Showalter began leasing a farmer's field that was just east of Lima Road and north of California Road, currently Coliseum Boulevard. He used the land to start up an airport, which later became known as Showalter Field. Showalter began with joyrides and flight lessons. No licenses were required back then. He convinced the military to base a few planes from the 309th Observational Squadron on the field, which led to a new name, Flight B Field. Showalter soon fell on hard times. He was forced to sell his airplane and get out of the airfield business. Paul Hobrock had taken lessons under Showalter, and in 1925, he and his flight student, George Sweet, pooled their resources and took over the airport, creating Swebrock Field. They built hangars along Lima Road and a few offices. They derived income from flight lessons, buying and selling airplanes, and hauling a few passengers. There were still no paved landing strips at Swebrock, only grassy fields with the weeds mowed down, and the only flight aid was their windsock. Aviation was quickly growing from a risky hobby to a commercial venture. In 1919, the U.S. Postal Service started using airplanes to carry the mail, and by the mid-20s, airmail service was a booming business. Communities throughout the country were competing for a piece of this business. Fort Wayne had a great location, being on the busy path to Chicago, but had been passed over as an airmail stop several times due to a lack of a proper airport. In March of 1925, Fort Wayne approved a resolution to create a municipal airport. They chose a site even further from the city than Swebrock, a site just north of Ludwig Road. The field already had been used by barnstormers and other aircraft since 1919, so it was already groomed from its occasional use as an airfield. By June 25th of 1925, Fort Wayne's first public airport was officially open. Like Swebrock, it was little more than an open field with a few buildings, with the words Fort Wayne spelled out on their roofs. This new airport was not called Smith Field. Ironically, Art Smith had been flying the very airmail route that Fort Wayne so desperately wanted. The airport was dedicated and named Paul Bear Municipal Airport in honor of the hometown World War I ace. Paul Frank Bear was born in Fort Wayne on January 29, 1894. He was son of a railroad engineer and was described by his father as the most timid of the 4 Bear children. Paul's older sister was known as the tough one. Paul was interested in all things mechanical and also in adventure. In 1916, he joined General Pershing in the fight against Pancho Villa and his bandits in New Mexico. This adventure didn't last long, and in 1917, he enlisted in the French Foreign Legion. He wanted to fly, and the French wanted American men to take to the skies for France in the war against the Germans. The U.S. was not in the war at that time, so Paul was assigned to the Franco-American Flying Corps, later called the Lafayette Escadrille. Paul received his flight training at Avoord. The French instructors didn't spend much time with these new pilots, as the controls were simple and the fighting techniques were still being discovered. They stressed landings over all else, as getting the machines back to fly again was paramount. Paul was commissioned lieutenant after just 24 hours of flying time and sent into battle. Paul wrote back to a friend home in Fort Wayne, "I have been flying in several parts of the front over here, in fact, the whole Western Front, as we are not assigned to any army and therefore move about all the time." On April 6, 1917, the United States officially entered the war. The U.S. had no Air Force at the time and a limited number of trained pilots. On February 18, 1918, all of the Americans who had been flying in the Lafayette Escadrille were made members of the U.S. Signal Corps, forming the 103rd Aero Squadron. This change meant little to the pilots, who continued to fly and fight as they had before. In early May, Bayer became the first American pilot to become an ace, shooting down at least 5 enemy planes. This landmark achievement went unnoticed. On May 31st, Douglas Campbell of the 94th Aero Squadron shot down his 5th enemy plane and was officially recognized as the first U.S. ace. The War Department didn't recognize Bayer's achievements because he was trained by the French and flying over the French front. Bayer took little notice of such things, instead focusing on his flying as he continued to rack up victories. On May 22nd, he secured his 9th and final victory as he himself was shot down over the German lines. In a letter to his mother, Bayer wrote, "My machine was riddled with bullets. I went through a tree and crashed into the ground, smashing my machine to bits. I have bruises all over, but I'm getting along all right. I'm in a hospital. When through here, I'll probably go to a British aviators prison camp somewhere in northern Germany." Paul was right and was the only Yank among 600 British prisoners in Grande. At war's end, he was released and came back to Fort Wayne in February of 1919 to a hero's welcome. He had received 20 awards and citations for his flying deeds and was the first aviator to receive the new Distinguished Service Cross from the United States. But Paul was even more reserved after the war, reluctant to accept the accolades and honors of his hometown, and avoided public appearances. Instead, Paul went right back into the cockpit, taking flying jobs in Michigan, New York, Louisiana, and Texas. In June of 1925, it's rumored Paul was in Hollywood flying for a movie, which is why he missed the dedication of the airport named after him. Captain Charles Nougasser came in his place. He was the top French ace of World War I and flew with Paul. He took part in a downtown parade and made the first official flight from the airport. Paul Bayer did visit the airport a year later and spoke of the great honor it was to be so recognized by his hometown. It was the Roaring '20s. New and daring things were in style, and Paul Bayer Municipal Airport was quickly becoming a hot spot of activity. Air shows were frequent in the summer. The Lincoln National Life Company marked its roof with a sign and an arrow pointing to the airport. New hangars and buildings were being constructed, fire equipment and mowers were purchased, and a phone line was run to the airport. In 1928, more land was acquired by the city, expanding the airport to 325 acres. Carl Bartel became the first airport manager, earning $3,000 a year. The SF Bowser and Company installed one of the nation's first underground fueling systems at Bayer Field, free of charge. The airport became a transportation hub. Captain Sir George Wilkins and his crew visited the airport and fueled their Lockheed Vega, the very same plane they then flew over the North Pole. In 1928, the other airport in town, the private Swebrock Field, sold their lease of land to Guy Means, a local General Motors dealer. Guy Means Field, as it came to be called, slowly disappeared into the urban sprawl as the public Bayer Field continued to grow. 1930 was a busy year for Paul Bayer Airport. There were more air shows bringing in tens of thousands of visitors to the airport, all to see daredevil flying and parachuting. All different types of airplanes took part in these events, from older biplanes to the newer low-wing monoplanes, and even the big tri-motor passenger planes. A relative newcomer to the skies was the Goodyear blimp. The Puritan was Goodyear's first twin-engine blimp and was the prototype for the fleet of airships that would follow. The 2-year-old airship came to Paul Bayer Airport in 1930 as part of the grand opening of Hangar No. 2, which still stands today.
Hangar No. 2 is a fascinating thing. It was built by the Massillon Bridge Company, which, as far as we know, didn't build many hangars over in Ohio. They were a bridge building company. But they built this with 3 doors on it, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's totally unheard of in a hangar of that age. This may well be the prototype for that. And it's a strong old buzzard. It's been out there for well over 70 years, still in use today, still serves many of its original functions. It was built way beyond the needs of 1929, 1930, with some with some projection that the airport would really be something in the city's future.
3 concrete runways and several taxiways were built. The runway design was a modified X pattern with the 2 main 3,000-foot runways running northwest, southeast, and southwest, northeast, following the prevailing winds. Another east-west runway was in the middle. This design practically eliminated the tricky crosswind landings using just a minimum of space. Paul Behr Field became the first airport in the U.S. to have floodlights that illuminated the landing areas for nighttime flights. And in 1930, after 5 years of building and grooming, Behr Field finally became part of the Air Mail Service. Lieutenant George Hill, the man on the left, was the first air mail pilot for Behr Field. On December 8th, 30 pounds of mail was loaded into a J-5 Stearman biplane, and Lieutenant Hill flew to deliver the mail to South Bend. On his way out of town, he flew over Memorial Park and dropped a wreath over Art Smith's monument. It would have been a fitting end to a great year for aviation in Behr Field and for Fort Wayne, but the year wasn't over yet. The very next day, the bad news came in. Lieutenant Paul Behr was killed in an airplane crash in China. He had just begun flying an airmail and passenger route for China Airways. Taking off in the fog, his flying boat hit the mast of a sailing vessel. The city mourned the loss of its fallen hero. Over 20,000 people paid their respects while Paul's body lay in state at the county courthouse. It was one of the largest military funerals ever conducted in Indiana. Paul Behr's spirit of adventure took him around the world. He was a highly decorated war veteran, but more than that, he flew with courage and honor. Paul was laid to rest at Lindenwood Cemetery, not far from Art Smith. Paul's namesake airport continued to grow. In March of 1931, TWA began passenger service at Behr Field, operating 2 flights a day to Chicago and Columbus, Ohio, using DC-2 aircraft. Trans-American and Capital Airways soon followed, and within a year, Fort Wayne was connected to other cities by air, cities such as Indianapolis, Toledo, and Detroit. Over 5,000 passengers went through Behr Field in its first 2 years of passenger operation. Flying was becoming mainstream, and it was becoming safer. But this was still during the early stages of aviation. Most small planes had no instruments, radios, or other navigational aids. Pilots still flew by dead reckoning or by the seat of their pants, often with less than favorable results. On April 21, 1932, Lieutenant George Hill was killed at Behr Field when returning from an airmail run to South Bend. He apparently made a hard landing, bounced high into the air, stalled, then crashed nose first into the ground. The airmail service at Behr Field was discontinued soon after. A broken oil line forced this Waco 10 down in a cornfield. The man in the straw hat is Clarence Cornish. Clarence had been involved in local aviation as far back as the Captain Showalter days. In 1934, he took over as airport manager for Behr Field. At this point, the airport was 9 years old. There were 303 acres under airport management. $54,000 had just been spent to improve and build hangars, aprons, offices, and runways. Hundreds of thousands of people had been at the airport to begin a trip, eat at the restaurant, or watch an air show. Famous aviators, such as Jimmy Doolittle, Wiley Post, and Wrong Way Corrigan visited the airfield. There were luncheons and hangar dances. New lights were added in 1936, and nighttime passenger service began in 1938. Paul Behr Airport was one of the most modern facilities in the Midwest. It was the place to be. In 1940, the Army Air Corps was looking for places to build airfields. They liked Fort Wayne and its municipal airport north of town, But turning this into an Army base would mean the end of passenger service and public access. The city convinced the Army to build a new airport southwest of town. And in February of 1941, construction began. But they still needed a name. The city chose Anthony Wayne Field, but the War Department fought against this name. Their policy was to name fields after flyers who had served in the Army Air Corps, and General Wayne, in the Army's words, was born long before flying machines were even seriously thought of. The city's World War I flying ace and hero, Lieutenant Paul Baer, was the natural second choice, but his name was already being used at the current airport. A plan was devised. Rename the current municipal airport to Smithfield in honor of Art Smith, the aviation pioneer that helped put Fort Wayne on the map. That would free up Lieutenant Paul Baer's name to be used for the new Army airport. The battle with the War Department ended in June. They agreed to name the new airport Baer Field, and the current airport was officially renamed Smithfield. The summer of 1941 saw a construction boom like none other. Local businesses had crews working around the clock to build the Army's new airport. Sunday drivers flocked to watch the progress of the building, clogging traffic along State Roads 1 and 3. The $3.5 million project was almost immediately expanded to $10 million as the war in Europe loomed closer. Concrete was laid at the rate of 6,500 cubic feet per day. Over 1,500 laborers worked to build over 100 buildings, multiple hangars, and two 6,000-foot-long runways. The base was officially dedicated on September 29th of 1941. On October 26th, this new Baer Field had its first open house, attracting over 10,000 visitors. The first group of fighters assigned to the base, the 31st Pursuit Group, arrived in their P-39 Air Cobras on December 6th. On the very next day, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and America was at war. The 31st Pursuit Group was quickly reassigned to the West Coast. Baer Field was fully mobilized as an air base with increased security and secrecy. The assignment was to organize and train fighter and bomber units for overseas duty. P-39s, T-6 trainers, and B-26 bombers were common sights at the airfield, along with the young cadets and pilots who flew them. On the north side of town, at the recently renamed Smithfield, it was a time of relative inactivity. Captain Clarence Cornish, who had been the airport's manager since 1934, was recalled into active duty, so Bob Schott was made the new manager for the field. For most local pilots, flying was on hold. The field lights were extinguished, and most private plane owners had to remove the wings from their aircraft. But overseas, local pilots were flying day and night. One pilot, Walker Bud Mahurin, flew P-47 Thunderbolt fighters for the mighty 8th Army Air Force 56th Fighter Group. Like Paul Baer before him, he became an ace, flying over Europe against the Germans, shooting down 21 enemy aircraft. And he too was shot down over enemy territory. He bailed out of his flaming P-47 Thunderbolt and landed safely in occupied France. He quickly hooked up with the French resistance and within 6 weeks made his escape and was back in London. He returned to Fort Wayne for a quick visit and to help sell war bonds. At one lunch rally, over $1 million in bonds were sold. Soon he was back in a fighter, this time over the Pacific, adding 2 Japanese victories to his total. But it wasn't just men who flew for our country during World War II. Before the war, Margaret Ringenberg took flying lessons at Smithfield.
I come from the old school, and I thought girls can't be pilots, so I wanted to be a stewardess. So I came out just to watch the airplanes, to get familiar with them, and finally I got to thinking that if I'm going to be riding in an airplane, I should know something about it.
Her dreams of becoming a stewardess soon were replaced with her passion for flying. But the airlines didn't hire female pilots, so what could she do? In 1943, the U.S. government stepped in, asking for her services as a pilot. They were creating a group of female pilots to fly military aircraft around the country as needed. Margaret said yes, and joined the military. They called the group the Women Air Force Service Pilots, or WASPs. They were the first women in history trained to fly military aircraft, fighters, trainers, bombers, anything that needed to be flown. As the war in Europe was coming to a close, the military disbanded the WASP units in late 1944, and the women went home. Margaret went back to Smithfield to continue her passion for flying.
In March of 1945, I got my flight instructor's rating and came to the airport to instruct, but who wants to ride with a girl pilot?
Margaret was again called to action for her flying abilities, this time by Fort Wayne radio station WGL.
August the 14th, 1945, I didn't have many students, so I was working the desk, answering the telephone, and WGL said that Japan was about to surrender, and the newspapers in Fort Wayne were both on strike. And the only way we could get the news out was by dropping leaflets over the city. So we packed 56,000 leaflets in the back of a couple J3 Cubs and dropped them over the city of Fort Wayne.
With the war over, the Army had little need for Bear Field and started withdrawing. With 3 long runways and huge amounts of concrete aprons and taxiways, Bear Field was one of the largest airports in the Midwest, perfect for the booming commercial aviation business. A passenger terminal was built on the west side of the airport. In October 1945, TWA left Smithfield, transferring operations to Bear Field. They were soon joined at Bear Field by Chicago and Southern Airlines, and the two shared the small new terminal. In December, the government officially placed Bear Field on inactive status. In December of '46, a fire swept through the huge main hangar and it burned to the ground. A new and larger terminal was built where the hangar once stood, complete with a new tower to replace the older military structure. The improvements at Bear Field marked the end of commercial passenger service at Smithfield. The roar of DC-3s was replaced with a buzz of small private planes as Smithfield became a haven for general aviation. Many veterans who learned how to fly during the war continued flying. Some even bought from Uncle Sam. You could pick up a surplus Mustang fighter for around $2,500, planes that are worth well over $1 million today. Recreational flying was a family affair. Flying in and around Smithfield was a common weekend activity, and there were numerous air shows throughout the year. As time passed, there were less and less public activities at Smithfield. The restaurant closed, hangars were torn down, along with the old weather station and some other outbuildings. One remarkable new hangar was constructed. Earl Smith designed and constructed a carousel hangar, which stores 4 airplanes on a carousel platform.
And then we have the round hangar, which only dates to the 60s. You wouldn't think of that as being historic, but it's a prototype. It's the one and only that was ever built. It's still in use, and it's a fascinating piece of machinery. The idea of putting in 4 airplanes and spinning them around to get the one you want and pulling it out.
Earl lacked the resources to effectively market his concept, making his hangar at Smithfield one of a kind. Without airmail or passenger service, runway use decreased, and the original asterisk 4 runway layout gradually changed. The east-west runway was removed, and the north-south runway was closed, leaving the X pattern that remains today. The city grew north and quickly surrounded the airport, locking it in and inhibiting future expansion. Bear Field, however, continued to grow. Commercial traffic was increasing every year. The terminal was expanded, more parking was added, new buildings went up for freight and cargo carriers. In 1991, Bear Field celebrated its 50th anniversary with great fanfare, including a commemorative booklet, tours, displays, and an air show. That same year, the name of the airport changed from Bear Field to Fort Wayne International Airport. Paul Bear Municipal Airport started life as little more than an open field, a few buildings, and a windsock. But it grew to become one of the most modern airfields in the Midwest. It gave its name and part of its existence to the larger airport south of the city, while becoming a haven for pilots and aviation enthusiasts. Its proud history will remain forever.
Back here to the right, about 50 feet, there used to be a fish pond, and they would throw people in the fish pond when they soloed.
Local production of The Story of Smith Field was brought to you in part by
Chapter 2 of the Experimental Aircraft Association promotes sport aviation and aeronautical education in northeastern Indiana. Over 1,100 children have experienced their first flight at Smith Airfield through the EAA's Young Eagles program. Chapter 2 activities include monthly meetings, social activities, cross-country trips, and more.
I'm an Experimental Aircraft Association member, and you can be one too, because they put the fun back in flying.
More information is available by calling 1-800-JOIN-EAA.